Hello again, everybody. This is our second class of the week for April 6th, and it's the second of two classes that we're having on the Protestant Reformation. I want to say first that earlier today I was going over the assignments that came in, and I was glad to see that in her assignment, her answer to the question about the Italian Renaissance, Samantha talked a lot about perspective and the importance of perspective. And I thought I would just pass that along. She pointed out that it began as an artist's technique, a way of highlighting the foreground by including a very, very deep background that can seem to go on for miles. It is clearly an artist's technique. You can see it in Perugino in your folder, Christ giving the keys of heaven to St. Peter, and of course also in Raphael's School of Athens. It's there as well. But in the Renaissance, it got to be much more than just an artist's technique for using background to illuminate foreground. She pointed out it carried over into areas that you just think it would can't imagine areas where it wouldn't have carried over, like medicine, for example. You can't imagine treating a case without knowing the medical history or the medical background, or any case in law, whether it's a question of innocence or guilt or any matter before the law, civil, criminal, whatever. The background is an important part of the decision that's going to eventually be rendered. Law, medicine, and of course in history. It's as important as anything can be. We're dealing with perspective on a 100 level, a freshman college level, and our background for the foreground. In the foreground, we have now the Protestant Reformation, but our background goes back to ancient Egypt. And I'm sure there's a skilled enough artist to include that kind of background in a flat canvas. But we do it in history, and we see the present, whether it's the present we're talking about here or whether it's 2020. We see the present better if we see it against the background. It's sharper and it's more meaningful. That's really what we're all about in this course. To go back to last class and continue with that theme of perspective for a moment. In any present situation, nobody knows what historical period he or she is in. That's for later ages to decide. But there's an interesting contrast in perspective between the last part of our class about Columbus and our first class about Martin Luther day before yesterday. Columbus expected to see and hoped to see the second coming of Christ as God's reward to Christian people, his people, for bringing about the bankruptcy and disappearance of Islam. We know that it didn't turn out, that what Christianity got instead of the second coming was the Reformation. Martin Luther labored under the idea, as most people did, in contrast to Columbus, that what was looming in the future was not the second coming of Christ. What was looming in the future was the coming of the Antichrist. And for Luther, as for so many other people, the Antichrist had two manifestations. The Antichrist was the plague, and the Antichrist was, again, the religion of Islam and the aggressive, apparently invincible Islamic empires of the Middle East, which looked like a sure bet at any moment to overrun small, divided Europe and bring about the extinction of Christianity. And people were afraid of that. And Luther believed that there was no way to withstand it unless we can get right with God again by fixing the church by reforming the church. And that's what Luther was all about, of course. And we got the Reformation off the ground last time. And we got to the point at the end where we were talking about the Reformation come to England, to English history, and to the English language. We didn't quite finish last time. We were pushing the limit of time there, I think. So I want to begin with the last page in the handout, The Reformation Comes to England, and we'll begin here at the end, we'll begin at the beginning of this topic. What I'm trying to say is we're going to begin with the death of Henry VIII in 1547. He left two things behind. He left behind a compromise solution, a national church that had elements of Protestantism in it and elements of Catholicism in it both. And he hoped in that way that everybody except the most extreme hardline Catholics on the one hand and the most aggressive Protestants on the other hand would find room under that umbrella of a church, so to speak, to find something there that they could hold on to and be content with entrusting their souls to. And that national church was the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. And you can say what you will about compromise solutions in religion, but at least Henry avoided the danger for his kingdom of the kind of religious warfare that tore Germany apart in the first half of the 1500s and is fixing to tear France apart even more so in the second half of the 1500s. That didn't come to England, not yet anyway. And so that's one of the things that Henry left behind. The other thing he left behind, he left three children behind. A son by his fourth wife, I believe, the son Edward, a daughter, Mary, by his first wife, whom he divorced for the mother of his second child, his second daughter, Elizabeth. The importance of a male heir to the throne was always important. I mentioned it last time. And you can see it here. When the king died, the succession didn't go to Mary, who was the oldest of the three, or to Elizabeth. The succession went to the youngest of the three, Edward, who was 9 years old when he became King of England. He was immediately, of course, surrounded by adult advisors, all of whom were Protestants and pretty adamant Protestants, and they pushed him in a more Protestant direction as far as church teachings and church practices were concerned, pushed him in a more Protestant direction than the king would have liked to have gone. Edward only lived 6 years. He died when he was 15 years old, and this time the succession went to the king's oldest daughter. There's no male heir, and so there's no choice but to have the succession go to Mary. Mary's mother had been Catholic, Spanish Catholic, and Mary all the way through has been true blue loyal to the old church, and certainly she never expected to become Queen of England. But when she did, she resolved to make the most of that opportunity and take England back to the world as it was before Martin Luther ever blew up. And this was what she attempted to do. It didn't work out very well for her. She's known in history by the name of a cocktail, Bloody Mary, and the blood is in reference to the blood of the Protestant martyrs that she shed in her attempt to bring England back into the fold of the Catholic Church, as if none of what we talked about last time had ever happened. It was unrealistic, it was sincere, it was heartfelt. There were many burnings of Protestant leaders, 3 in one day. Catholics later mocked those 3 as the 3 blind mice. And it didn't turn out well. It didn't turn out well at all. When she died, a lonely death, a sad, lonely, painful death, unmourned by just about anybody, her place was taken by Elizabeth. And Elizabeth's going to put the lie to what I was saying last time about a male being much preferable to a female as sovereign in all circumstances, because Elizabeth was one of the great rulers of England. She was one of the great rulers of history, and as far as I can tell, she was the first great female ruler in history. I think you have to go back to ancient Egypt to find a woman with that kind of power and that kind of intelligence and that kind of drive. She had her hands full, number one, with getting things back on the track her father had put them, getting things back on the track Henry VIII had put them as far as the Church of England was concerned. And she meant business. She meant business about that. Mary had shed a lot of Protestant blood. Elizabeth had no compunction about Catholic priests being hunted down, tortured, and executed. They were too extreme. They were too reminiscent of the old days for her and for most people. So there's blame to go around in the way these things were put through in the 16th century. The second thing she had to worry about was Spain. Spain had designs on conquering England. Spain looked invincible as far as England was concerned, far larger, far more powerful, far more of a naval power, a land power as well, with all of the wealth of South America behind it now, all the gold of the Aztecs and all the gold of the Incas behind it. Spain was a powerhouse and meant to bring about, after Mary's death, what Mary had hoped to accomplish while living. Elizabeth prevented that from happening and saved the country. She was a great ruler, without any question about it. And we'll pick up the story of England right after her death in 1603. She never married. She never had a child. The first American colonies were established very late in her reign, and the colony in Virginia was obviously named in her honor. She died without a male heir, a close male heir, and we'll see the consequences of that. They're enormous, and we'll see the consequences of that in a class or two. That takes us to the third part of the handout. The Reformation continues. So let's go there. We're on page. I'm not sure of the page number, but you'll see it. What this part of the handout, the Reformation continues, wants you to understand is that the Reformation had an impact in different ways at different times. There were different levels of change. They were all great. I mean, in power and magnitude. The first great change that had come was the change in doctrine, and that was Martin Luther and his ideas about how religion ought to be based, the theology that the true religion ought to have. That remains true for Protestants all the way through down to 2020. It is the first level of change that the Reformation brings, is this great change in the teaching of the church, the doctrine of the church, and that goes to the powerful mind of Martin Luther. Luther died in 1537, I think, and a new generation of Protestant leaders emerged after Luther's death. And your handout mentions two. One in passing, John Knox, who took Protestantism to Scotland in the far north of England, where it took the form of the Presbyterian Church. So now we have another denomination, yet another denomination, where there used to be one united Christian family. We're fragmenting now. We've got Presbyterian Church in Scotland. But even more importantly than John Knox was John Calvin. And he gets most of the coverage in this section. John Calvin was French. He was a lawyer by profession. In the middle of the 1530s, he gave up his career in law and became a Protestant. And as a Protestant theologian, he wrote a magnificent book laying down all of the principles of Martin Luther's teaching called The Institutes of the Christian Religion, 1535. Calvin's belief, now Calvin is a second generation Protestant. He's the standard bearer for Protestantism in its second generation. Calvin believed, in terms of doctrine, everything that Martin Luther had believed, but in some cases he puts a different tone on things, and in one important respect, he brings about an important change in what Luther had thought. As far as the tone was concerned, Calvin, much more than Luther, was inclined to think towards predestination. The idea that you and I are not really free in our choices, in the sense that God knows what we are going to choose and what our fate at the end of our lives here is going to be. And there is nothing either one of us can do to alter that predetermined outcome. You can see it in Luther, but Calvin stresses it a lot more. Calvin used it as a platform to put forward the idea that the church ought to be ruled. First, the church ought to rule the state, and second, the church ought to be ruled by those about whom there is no doubt whatsoever that they have been chosen for salvation. Calvin called those few the elect. You can think of it maybe as the selected few. About these people, within them, there is no doubt whatsoever that they have been chosen for salvation, and their conduct and their bearing and their leadership is such that you and I will come to recognize the same thing that they recognize in themselves. That was a little different in tone from Luther. Another difference in tone from Luther was Calvin's emphasis on discipline. And by discipline, he meant how we act in the profession of our faith. Church services are mandatory, and you better be there. The sermons are long, very long, and more than once a week, and you must be there or there are penalties to be paid. There is no alcohol, of course, no tobacco, of course, no gambling or betting of any kind, of course, no recreational activities of any kind other than single and isolated acts, and no sports, as we would call them, no celebrations of any kind, particularly not Christmas. Christmas not something to be celebrated. Christmas cards are gone out the window, wreaths, trees, presents, all of that has come into being and had come into being by that time already. All it's got to go. Businesses cannot be opened but on certain days, and there are many days when businesses can't be opened during the course of a regular week, and of course many church observances as well. And all of these things are ironclad. There can be no exception to them. Records are kept. Memories are long. Protestants are going to be disciplined people. And the third change in tone that Calvin brings about in what Luther had to say was in the idea of, it's kind of saying the same thing again about the elect. Calvin believed that in a way very similar to the Hebrews in the time of the book of Judges, that it is the elect who should rule the community, not just the church, but the entire community. That the government, in other words, is in the hands of those predestined for salvation, and in no other hands. Those were all differences in tone. But here comes now a major difference in not in tone, but an innovation, I'm trying to say, an innovation that Calvin brings in. And that is in the question of resistance to Catholic authority. Luther, you remember, had taught that if you're unfortunate enough to be a Protestant living under a Catholic sovereign, under a Catholic ruler, you have no choice before God except to do what you're told, obey the law, keep the faith, brother. Keep the faith. If you can keep the faith in circumstances like that, unfair as they might be, if you can keep the faith in circumstances like that, you are certainly a candidate for salvation. Calvin disagreed. Calvin thought that in certain circumstances, very narrowly defined, and he defined them in his Institutes of the Christian Religion, in certain circumstances, he believed God is well pleased if his Protestant people under Catholic rulers will rise up and overthrow them. Protestantism become politically revolutionary. Protestants in France, and this might be a good time to go to the map on page 434. Protestants in France, the followers of John Calvin in France, were called Huguenots, Huguenots. And they resisted the Catholic kings of France tooth and nail in a half century of religious wars that about destroyed France. There were English followers of John Calvin as well, and they were called Puritans. And their quarrel was not so much with Elizabeth. She was the defender of the country, and you need to ride with her, so to speak. Their quarrel was with the Church of England. They hated the Church of England. They believed the Church of England, it's not a pretty phrase, they believed the Church of England was contaminated by Catholic filth. Too much carryover, particularly government of the church by bishops appointed by the king. That's Catholicism, it's filth. It has to be cleaned out. The word Puritan comes from purify, or to clean out. And that was their whole approach. And we'll see in the next century, the Puritans will rise up in armed revolt and change English history forever, change the history of the English-speaking peoples forever in that rising up. But that's for a class not too much later, but for a later class. This chapter, this part of the handout ends with the I'm going to leave the Anabaptists out and come to them next class. They represent the third level of Reformation change. The first is doctrine, the second is political opposition, the third is what the Anabaptists stood for. I want to pass over that for the present and go to the fourth and last level of change in the Reformation era, and that is the Catholic Reformation. I mentioned last time at the end of class that the old church was down, but it wasn't out, and it comes roaring back. And the fact of the matter is that for all of the millions who became Protestant of one kind or another, many more millions stayed true blue, to the true blue loyal, to the old faith. And that is the work, that is the result of the work of the Catholic Reformation, a reformation of the church coming from within the church rather than from groups that have either wanted to be by and apart themselves or who've been forced out. You can say Luther might have wanted to have stayed within the church and reform it from within, but was forced out, or maybe not. That's a difficult call. The Catholic Reform, or the Catholic Reformation, the great comeback of the church, revolved around two popes and one layman who became a saint. The layman who became a saint, we should talk about first. This is Ignatius Loyola. We have at least two universities in this country that I know of that carry the name Loyola, one in Chicago, the other in New Orleans. And Loyola believed, and the reason for that is that Loyola believed that if the church were to make its comeback, it would have to be through two different routes, and one was education, and the other was missionary work in the wider world. Now, if you were to pick up a catalog from Loyola, New Orleans, or Loyola, Chicago, great four-year universities, you'd probably find, I'm sure you'd find, in the back of the catalog, there'd be an alphabetical list of the faculty members, and it would show you their fields of interest and where they studied. And in those two universities, you'll see two initials after most faculty members' names. And the initials are SJ. And what that stands for, what the SJ stands for, is an order or a organization that Loyola formed of Catholic teachers and Catholic missionaries. This order or organization that he formed was known as the Society of Jesus, SJ, and individual members are known as Jesuits. And the Society of Jesus and the Jesuits, with their emphasis on education and missionary work, have much to do with the Catholic Church rallying here at the last part of these stages of the Reformation. Before I talk about the popes, we should never doubt, of course, that the church was going to rally. Think back through the history. This church survived Rome. This church, both with Rome's help after Constantine and without it, this church withstood the barbarians. This church saved itself, and in the process saved civilization. It's not going to take something like this Reformation lying down. It's not in its blood. And it makes an amazing comeback here. Now, there's some very negative features about it that we don't like at all. We'll get to them in just a second. But the church made a strong comeback. Loyola had a lot to do with it, and the two Catholic Reformation popes were really in the leadership positions, Paul III and Paul IV. Paul IV took four very important decisions at the beginning of his papacy, which launch the Catholic reform. First, I'm sorry, wrong page. First, he laid it down that begins with an admission of guilt to say, indeed, the many abuses and corruptions that the Protestants charge us with, guilty as charged, our fault. But rest assured, we are going to clean all of that up post haste. And this church is going to come out of this as clean as a hound's tooth. You can take my word for it as Christ's man on earth. Secondly, as if to give teeth to what he was talking about, what he meant, he established the Jesuit order. He gave the papal seal of approval to the Jesuit order. That was a big step. It put the Society of Jesus in motion in education, higher education, and missionary work. Third, he convened the Reform Council of Trent. The Council of Trent did the work of the Catholic Reform. It met from 1545 to 1563. It was a long-running council in which the assembled bishops, the whole hierarchy of the church, met to decide what's to be done to keep the church in being in the midst of this Protestant onslaught. Remember that from the age of faith, and it holds true here in the belief of the church, that the church is Christ's ministry on earth. It is the successor to Jesus and the apostles. That's the Catholic teaching. And the Pope himself is Christ's man on earth. Whoever is Pope is a link in a long chain. Goes all the way back to St. Peter, the first bishop of Rome. Well, when the Council of Trent met, it made a very important decision right at the beginning of the council. And that decision was that there's going to be no concession made to doctrine. We're not going to give an inch to Luther on doctrine. We give an inch, a little bit of compromise, then the whole thing going to come unraveled. And we have to take a hard line and adhere to it at the beginning and all the way through if the church is to survive. It was the right decision. Tactically and strategically, it was the right decision. The second decision that was made was, as an example, if Luther puts church interpretation in the hands of believers, we say the church interprets the Bible. Nobody else. Case closed. The church interprets the Bible. For you, for me. That's one of the reasons it's here. Third, the church is going to affirm against Luther that salvation comes by faith and by works, deeds. It's not a question of faith alone, as Luther had said, but faith and works. Fourth, church tradition, church law, pronouncements of popes, decisions of councils, they have equal weight with the Bible in Christian revelation. When the church speaks, in other words, it teaches that it speaks for God. And then about indulgences. This one surprises a little bit. The church decided that indulgences are okay in theory. They were much abused, corrupted, all of that's going to end, but a pardon for sins committed is not a ticket to heaven. It's only a pardon. It's only a reprieve kind of thing. We're going to adhere to that line. As far as I know, that's the line down to the present 2020. The following are not so positive or even respectable. There was established what was called the Inquisition. The Inquisition is and there are many Inquisitions. An Inquisition is a traveling board of investigation, and there were many of them. And the purpose of these kind of circuit riding investigation committees was to determine if in this area or that area or any area there were secret Protestants who need to be identified, singled out, and punished. People who are going through the motions of Catholic worship, but are actually at home in secret and amongst themselves Protestants. They've got to be exposed. They've got to be brought before the bar of justice. And it's the job of the Inquisition to do just that, to bring these people to investigation, to elicit confessions from them by torture, if need be, and eradicate these wolves in sheep's clothing who are everywhere amongst us. The Inquisition was infamous for cruelty and the fine arts of torture. It gives the Catholic reform a bad name. It is a bad look, no getting around it. The other thing, same line of thinking, was called the Index. The Index was a publication that the church put out on a yearly basis, and what the Index was a list of books that no Christian ought ever to read. A list of books that are best burned better burning these books than doing anything else with them. And the clear implication was that the owner of these books could get burned too, but clearly the books are burned, forbidden reading, in other words, closing that down, closing the freedom to read and to think down. These were not admirable traits of the Catholic Reformation. Overall, the whole thing is going to be put forward, not with a printing press so much, but it's going to be put forward in the way the church had always put its best foot forward. And you've got a lot of evidence for this in your 1,000 words folder. The message of the Catholic Reform is going to be put forward in painting and in sculpture and in architecture. And this is the time of the grand Christian architecture, St. Peter's in Rome being the most obvious example. But look also in your folder at the sculptures by Bernini, that highly emotional sculpture of Constantine beholding the vision of God in the sky just prior to making Christianity legal. Or the Roman centurion Longinus having just pierced our Savior's side on the cross and then is overcome by looking up and seeing, we don't know what, but it's obvious that he sees there what he has done and how regrettable it was. Just two examples, and it carried over into music as well. As a last point, look at a picture of St. Peter's Square. Sculptor Bernini designed it. Michelangelo built the dome over the graves of Peter and Paul. It's the focal point of the Catholic world. And it's a magnificent creation. You don't have to be Catholic, and I'm not. You don't have to be Catholic to give the church credit for saving civilization way back and glorifying the church in its hour of need here in the Catholic Reform. But history works in strange ways, and as you look at that picture of St. Peter's, and I urge you to, as you look at that picture of St. Peter's, remember this: when those indulgence sellers came to Martin Luther's town in 1517, hawking their wares, it was an all-out effort to raise money for the completion of St. Peter's in Rome. That's what that indulgence sale was all about, to raise money for the construction of St. Peter's in Rome. So when you look at St. Peter's, credit where credit is due, a great creation, moving creation. Where did the money for that come from? Luther knew where it came from, and he thought it was ill spent. He may not have known where it was going, but he thought that money was ill spent and fraudulently put forward. We'll go ahead next time, and we'll have the assignments out for you. Good deal.